Standing as Earth's most imposing natural barrier, the Himalayan mountain range has captivated humanity for millennia. These towering peaks represent more than just geological wonder. They've served as political boundaries, cultural divides, and economic obstacles for the nations surrounding them. But today, something unprecedented is happening beneath these ancient mountains. A massive infrastructure project is quietly advancing, one that could fundamentally alter the geopolitical landscape of South Asia. Deep within the Himalayas, engineers are working on what many consider one of the most ambitious railway projects ever attempted. This isn't just another transportation route. It's a 540-kilometer engineering marvel that will connect China directly to Nepal, threading through some of the most unforgiving terrain on the planet. And in New Delhi, officials are watching with growing concern. The story of this railway goes far beyond tracks and tunnels. It's about a small, landlocked nation's desperate struggle for economic independence, a rising superpower's expanding influence, and a regional giant's fear of losing control. To understand why this railway matters so much, we need to understand Nepal's unique predicament and the forces that have shaped its destiny for decades. Nepal's geographic prison. Nestled between two of Asia's most powerful nations, Nepal occupies one of the world's most strategically complex positions. This Himalayan nation, roughly 147,000 square kilometers in size, is home to nearly 29 million people who live in the shadow of 8 of the world's 10 highest peaks, including the legendary Mount Everest. But Nepal's breathtaking geography comes with a devastating economic cost. Unlike most countries that can access global markets through seaports, Nepal is completely landlocked. To the north, the Himalayan wall rises like an impenetrable fortress. To the south, east, and west, India surrounds Nepal almost entirely. This geographic reality has created a dependency relationship that has defined Nepal's modern history. Despite being blessed with natural beauty that attracts adventurers and spiritual seekers from around the globe, Nepal remains one of Asia's poorest nations. Its total economic output hovers around $30 billion annually, a figure that places it among the least developed countries in the region. When you break that down per person, the average Nepali earns just $1,100 a year, struggling to meet basic needs in an economy that has remained stubbornly stagnant. Approximately 70% of Nepal's population still depends on agriculture for survival, cultivating rice, corn, and wheat on terraced mountainsides and in the fertile lowlands of the Terai region. This heavy reliance on subsistence farming reflects an economy that hasn't been able to diversify or modernize at the pace of its neighbors. And while there are many factors behind Nepal's economic struggles, one stands out above all others: India's controlling influence over its smaller northern neighbor. The India factor. Control through geography. To call Nepal landlocked doesn't quite capture the full picture. The country isn't just without ocean access. It's functionally dependent on India for nearly everything that connects it to the outside world. This dependency didn't happen by accident. It's the result of decades of strategic positioning by India, which has leveraged geography to maintain political and economic influence over its Himalayan neighbor. Consider Nepal's reality. Virtually all trade routes pass through Indian territory. Every shipment of fuel, every import of manufactured goods, every export heading to international markets must first cross Indian checkpoints. India doesn't just control the roads, it controls the flow of essential resources. Electricity that powers Nepali homes largely comes from Indian grids. Water infrastructure relies heavily on Indian cooperation. The import of basic materials requires approval from Indian customs officials who can delay or deny shipments at will. This isn't merely inconvenient, it's a form of economic leverage that India has used repeatedly to influence Nepali politics. When Nepal's government makes decisions that New Delhi disapproves of, the consequences can be immediate and severe. India has established numerous checkpoints and military outposts along the border, ostensibly for security, but with the clear effect of monitoring and controlling the movement of people and goods. The most dramatic example of this power dynamic came in 2015, when Nepal adopted a new constitution that India viewed as problematic. Within days, trucks carrying essential supplies stopped crossing the border. Fuel stations ran dry. Hospitals struggled to maintain power. Ordinary Nepalis waited in lines that stretched for blocks, hoping to buy cooking gas. India officially denied imposing a blockade, calling it a protest by ethnic groups in Nepal's southern plains. But the message was unmistakable: step out of line, and the lifeline gets cut. For Nepali leaders, this crisis crystallized a hard truth they'd known for years: economic sovereignty is impossible without alternatives. As long as India remained the only gateway to the world, Nepal would remain, in effect, a client state. The question wasn't whether to seek other partnerships, but how. Enter the dragon: China's strategic opportunity. China has been watching Nepal's predicament with great interest. For Beijing, the Himalayan nation represents both a strategic opportunity and a geographical puzzle. For decades, the relationship between China and Nepal existed primarily on paper, with limited practical connections due to the mountain barrier that separated them. There was one road, a highway that wound through treacherous mountain passes, often closed by landslides and snowstorms, capable of handling only limited traffic even in the best conditions. This single lifeline was nowhere near sufficient to support meaningful economic exchange. If China wanted to build real influence in Nepal, if Nepal wanted genuine alternatives to Indian dependency, something more substantial was needed. The answer came in the form of China's massive Belt and Road Initiative, an ambitious global infrastructure program designed to expand Chinese economic and political influence across Asia, Africa, and beyond. Nepal, seeking exactly the kind of major infrastructure investment that could transform its economic prospects, enthusiastically signed on to the initiative. What emerged from subsequent negotiations was the China-Nepal Railway, an infrastructure project so ambitious that many experts initially dismissed it as impossible. The proposed route would stretch approximately 540 kilometers, with about 444 kilometers running through Chinese territory in Tibet, and roughly 90 kilometers extending into Nepal. The railway would begin in Shigatse, a major Tibetan city, pass through the border town of Girong, and eventually reach Kathmandu, Nepal's capital. On paper, it sounds straightforward. In reality, it requires conquering what many engineers consider the most challenging terrain on Earth: engineering the impossible. The Himalayas aren't just tall, they're geologically young, seismically active, and meteorologically violent. These mountains are still rising, pushed upward by the collision of the Indian and Eurasian tectonic plates at a rate of several centimeters per year. This ongoing geological drama means the region experiences frequent earthquakes, some devastating. The China-Nepal Railway must navigate through this chaos. Although the route doesn't cross the highest peaks, it faces challenges that make most infrastructure projects look simple by comparison. The starting point in Shigatse sits at an elevation of over 4,000 meters above sea level. From there, the railway must descend nearly 3,000 meters to reach Kathmandu, which sits at approximately 1,400 meters elevation. That elevation drop of 3,000 meters over a relatively short distance creates engineering nightmares. Traditional railway design principles simply don't work. You can't lay tracks on slopes that steep without building extensive support structures. According to feasibility studies conducted in 2018, approximately 98% of the entire railway will consist of either bridges or tunnels. Let that sink in. Out of 540 kilometers, only about 10 kilometers will be conventional railway on solid ground. The project requires constructing an estimated 45 separate tunnels with a combined length of roughly 272 kilometers. That's more than half the entire route passing through the mountain itself. The longest of these tunnels would stretch approximately 25 kilometers, boring directly through the Himalayan range, a feat of engineering that would rank among the world's most impressive underground structures. And the bridges? They must span deep gorges and unstable valleys, some rising hundreds of meters above riverbeds that rage with glacial meltwater during summer months and freeze solid in winter. These aren't simple overpasses. They're massive structures that must withstand earthquakes, extreme temperature variations, and the constant threat of landslides that could undermine their foundations. The forces of nature. Building infrastructure in the Himalayas means battling nature at its most extreme. The region experiences some of the planet's most severe weather variations. Summer monsoons dump torrential rains that trigger catastrophic landslides, washing away roads and burying entire valleys in mud. Winter brings snow measured in meters, with temperatures that can freeze diesel fuel and make metal brittle. Glaciers cover much of the higher elevations, their slow movement grinding and crushing anything in their path. As climate change accelerates glacial melting, the risks intensify. Glacial lake outburst floods have become increasingly common, releasing millions of cubic meters of water that can destroy infrastructure in minutes. The seismic threat alone would discourage most railway projects. The region sits on one of Earth's most active fault lines. Major earthquakes strike with devastating regularity. Nepal experienced catastrophic quakes in 2015 that killed thousands and destroyed countless structures. Any railway built here must be designed not just to survive moderate shaking, but to withstand the violent ground motion of a major earthquake without catastrophic failure. Chinese engineers are addressing these challenges with technology and techniques refined on previous high-altitude projects, particularly the Qinghai-Tibet Railway, which demonstrated that rail service is possible in extreme conditions previously considered impossible. That railway, completed in 2006, operates across permafrost at elevations exceeding 5,000 meters, making it the highest railway in the world. But the China-Nepal Railway presents new challenges. The Qinghai-Tibet Railway crosses relatively stable plateau terrain. The Himalayan route requires tunneling through actively deforming rock, spanning unstable slopes, and maintaining operations in a far more seismically active zone. It's not just high-altitude engineering. It's high-altitude engineering in one of the most geologically violent places on Earth. The long silence and sudden revival. When China first announced plans for the railway in 2018, initial assessments suggested construction could begin relatively quickly. Engineering teams conducted surveys, feasibility studies were completed, and both governments expressed enthusiasm. Then something unexpected happened: silence. For months, then years, news about the project dried up. Announcements stopped. Construction timelines vanished. International observers began speculating that China had quietly abandoned the project, concluding that even for Chinese engineering capabilities, the Himalayas presented too great a challenge. Perhaps Nepal had gotten cold feet about the costs. Perhaps geopolitical pressures had shifted priorities. These speculations proved premature. In 2021, both governments surprised the world by announcing not just the continuation of the project, but a massive financial commitment, $8 billion in investment with an expected construction timeline of 7.5 years. The message was clear: this railway would be built, regardless of the obstacles. Chinese officials and engineers were candid about the challenges ahead. This wouldn't just be another infrastructure project, even by the ambitious standards of China's Belt and Road Initiative. Senior engineers publicly acknowledged that the China-Nepal Railway would rank among the most difficult railway construction projects ever attempted anywhere in the world. They weren't overstating the case. Beyond tracks, the strategic calculation. Railways are never just about transportation. Throughout history, they've been instruments of empire, engines of economic transformation, and tools of geopolitical influence. The China-Nepal Railway is no exception. Understanding its true significance requires looking beyond the engineering specifications to the strategic calculations driving both China and Nepal. For China, this railway represents a crucial link in a much larger network. The Belt and Road Initiative isn't merely about building disconnected infrastructure projects. It's about creating integrated transportation corridors that connect Chinese industrial centers to markets and resources across Asia and beyond. The China-Nepal Railway would serve as a vital connection between the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia, creating new trade routes that bypass traditional corridors. Once the railway is operational, Chinese goods can flow directly into Nepal and potentially beyond, reaching markets that previously required shipping through multiple countries or expensive air freight. The economic benefits for China are substantial, but perhaps not the primary motivation. More important is the strategic positioning. By establishing direct infrastructure connections to countries in India's traditional sphere of influence, China expands its diplomatic leverage and creates dependencies that favor Beijing's interests. For Chinese policymakers, every country connected to Chinese infrastructure becomes more aligned with Chinese positions on international issues, more dependent on Chinese economic goodwill, and less influenced by rival powers. It's soft power backed by hard infrastructure. Railroads, quite literally, that bind nations together in ways that are difficult to reverse. Nepal's calculus, freedom through alternatives. From Nepal's perspective, the railway represents something even more fundamental, a pathway to genuine independence. For a landlocked nation that has spent decades effectively controlled by its southern neighbor, the opportunity to establish direct connections with another major power is transformative. Once operational, the railway would enable Nepal to import Chinese goods without Indian permission, export Nepali products through Chinese ports, and access international markets via routes that don't pass through Indian territory. Hydroelectric equipment, machinery, consumer goods, fuel, all could flow from China directly into Nepal, breaking India's monopoly on supply routes. The economic implications are enormous. Nepal possesses significant hydroelectric potential in its mountain rivers, but developing that potential requires importing massive amounts of construction equipment. With reliable access to Chinese suppliers and financing, Nepal could finally begin building the energy infrastructure that might power industrial development. Tourism, already a significant part of Nepal's economy, could expand dramatically with improved transportation links. Currently, most international visitors arrive through Indian airports or overland routes controlled by India. A railway connection to China would open new paths for tourists from the world's most populous nation and beyond, potentially doubling or tripling visitor numbers. Agricultural exports could find new markets. Nepali handicrafts could reach Chinese consumers. And perhaps most importantly, Nepali workers and students would have easier access to opportunities in China, strengthening people-to-people connections that build long-term relationships between nations. But the benefits go beyond economics. The railway would fundamentally alter Nepal's negotiating position with India. No longer would Indian blockades represent existential threats. When Indian officials object to Nepali policies, Kathmandu would have the option of strengthening ties with Beijing instead. This doesn't mean Nepal would abandon its relationship with India. Geography alone ensures that relationship remains crucial, but it would transform that relationship from one of dependency to one of choice. In New Delhi, the China-Nepal Railway is viewed with a fair bit of alarm. For decades, India has maintained influence over Nepal through a combination of cultural ties, economic leverage, and, geographic necessity. The railway threatens to undermine all three. Indian strategists understand that once Nepal has genuine alternatives to Indian supply routes, the diplomatic leverage that has defined the relationship just evaporates. Economic sanctions become ineffective if they can be circumvented, and border closures lose their sting if goods can arrive from the north instead of the south. Beyond Nepal specifically, India sees the railway as part of a broader pattern of Chinese encroachment in South Asia. Chinese-funded ports in Sri Lanka, infrastructure investments in Bangladesh, economic partnerships with Pakistan. Beijing has systematically built relationships with every one of India's neighbors, often providing the exact type of development assistance that these countries desperately need, but India cannot or will not provide. The railway also raises security concerns in New Delhi. While neither China nor Nepal harbors aggressive intentions toward India, the military implications of a direct rail link between Chinese territory and the Indian border haven't escaped notice. Infrastructure built for commerce can also move military equipment, though this concern is somewhat overstated given that both nations already share a long border. India's response has been multifaceted. Officially, Indian diplomats have expressed concern about the environmental impact of construction and questioned the economic viability of the project. Unofficially, there have been attempts to offer Nepal alternative infrastructure investments, though these have been slow to materialize and lack the scale of Chinese proposals. The fundamental challenge for India is that opposing the railway too aggressively risks pushing Nepal further toward China, while accepting it means acknowledging a diminished role in Nepali affairs. It's a strategic dilemma with no easy solutions, made more difficult by the fact that India's past treatment of Nepal has created genuine grievances that Chinese diplomats can exploit. The China-Nepal Railway cannot be understood in isolation. It's really just one piece of a global infrastructure program that has reshaped geopolitics across 3 continents. Since announcing the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, China has committed hundreds of billions of dollars to infrastructure projects in more than 60 countries. These projects range from highways in Pakistan to ports in Africa, railways in Southeast Asia, to power plants in Eastern Europe. The common thread is Chinese financing, Chinese construction firms, and infrastructure that connects developing nations to Chinese markets and supply chains. Critics argue that Belt and Road creates debt dependencies, saddling poor countries with loans they cannot repay, and giving China leverage over their policies. There have been some pretty notable cases where countries struggled with Chinese debt, most famously Sri Lanka, which ended up leasing a Chinese-built port to a Chinese company for 99 years when it couldn't meet loan obligations. Supporters counter that Belt and Road provides infrastructure that wealthy Western nations promised but never delivered, filling a genuine development gap in countries that have been neglected by traditional aid providers. They point out that accusations of debt-trap diplomacy often come from countries that have themselves used economic leverage to advance strategic interests. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes. Belt and Road projects vary enormously in their terms, implementation, and outcomes. Some have been genuinely beneficial to recipient countries. Others have been marked by corruption, cost overruns, and questionable economics. The China-Nepal Railway will be judged by whether it delivers the promised benefits to Nepal or becomes another infrastructure project that serves Chinese interests primarily. Beyond the geopolitics and engineering challenges, there's a human dimension to this story that often gets, honestly, a bit lost. For millions of Nepalis, the railway represents hope. Hope for better economic opportunities, hope for connections to the wider world, hope that their children might have futures that don't require leaving their homeland to find work. Nepal has one of the world's highest rates of labor migration, with hundreds of thousands of young men working in Gulf countries, Malaysia, and India, sending remittances home that keep their families afloat. It's an economic strategy born of desperation, one that tears apart families and exposes workers to exploitation and abuse. The promise of the railway is that Nepal might finally develop its own economy sufficiently to keep its young people home, offering them opportunities and dignity in their own country. Whether that promise will be fulfilled remains to be seen, but for now, it represents something that has been in short supply, a reason for optimism about the future. For the engineers and construction workers building the railway, the project is a different kind of challenge. They're attempting something that has never been done before, working in conditions that test human endurance and technical skill. The construction camps scattered across the Himalayan slopes house thousands of workers who labor in thin air, extreme cold, and constant danger from rockfalls and avalanches. Chinese engineering culture emphasizes overcoming obstacles through determination and technical innovation. The construction sites have become proving grounds for new tunneling techniques, advanced surveying methods, and construction materials designed to withstand seismic forces. Lessons learned here will influence infrastructure projects for decades to come. As of early 2025, construction is proceeding on the Chinese section of the railway, though at a pace slower than initial projections suggested. The Tibetan terrain has proven even more challenging than anticipated, with unexpected geological formations requiring changes to tunnel routes and additional stabilization work. The section from Shigatse to Girong, the border town, has seen the most progress, with several tunnel sections completed and bridge foundations laid. Chinese authorities have released limited information about construction progress, making it difficult to assess how closely the project is adhering to its 7.5-year timeline announced in 2021. The Nepali section faces different challenges. While the terrain on the Nepali side is less extreme than the Tibetan plateau, the country lacks the construction capacity and experience for a project of this scale.